Hi, I'm Paisley Rekdal. I'm friends with David Grosskopf, and I am here to talk to you about the difference between abstract and concrete language and why we should care about that. This video is actually for you, PJ. I was told to call you out on this. For those of you guys who don't know who I am, which is all of you, I assume, I'm a poet who lives in Utah. I direct the creative writing program out there, and I teach poetry for a living, and I write poetry for a living. Yeah, I'm one of those people. So I love talking about poetry, which, as you can imagine, makes me incredibly popular for, everybody. But I do want to talk about Elizabeth Bishop's The Fish today, because the ways in which she uses abstract versus concrete language, I think will tell you a lot about when we use abstract language, when we use concrete language, and how you can get to the big ideas through actually the small physical details that make up the life of all of us. You probably have heard this phrase, or maybe you haven't, no ideas but in things. It was said by a poet named William Carlos Williams, who you probably know because you've read The Red Wheelbarrow, which is one of my least favorite poems in the entire universe. I hate the chickens, I hate the red wheelbarrow, so I'm not talking about that. But what Williams was getting at was this idea that you can't get to the larger without going through the smaller first. That in fact all of our ideas are located in small physical details. And this is something I think that you see over and over and over again with the fish. So I just want to point out some of the details that Elizabeth Bishop has in this poem, and then talk about how those small details add up to something really enormous by the end. So you've already read the poem. I'm going to read a few lines out that I think are quite interesting. So as soon as she catches this tremendous fish and holds him beside the boat, half out of water, with my hook fast in a corner of his mouth, we get three interesting adjectives. He is a grunting weight, battered and venerable and homely. If you spend a little time thinking about these words, they don't actually go together necessarily. Something that's venerable is something meant to be revered. So why is it homely then? Why is it also battered? It's weighted, it's a very heavy fish, but it's also grunting. Is it dead or is it alive? Is it venerable or is it something kind of actually trashy and sad, battered and homely? Then she goes on to describe his brown skin, which hangs in strips like ancient wallpaper, and its pattern of darker brown was like wallpaper, shapes like full-blown roses, stained and lost through age. One of the things that I like about this series of images is that it's actually a fairly domestic kind of image for a fish. We might imagine that a fish would be described in very natural terms. She's just pulled it out of a lake. She's about to hopefully eat this thing. And yet all of the imagery that she's using here, it would suggest something located in the home. It's wallpaper-like. And then of course the wallpaper itself is described as having shapes like full-blown roses, stained and lost through age. Then she changes yet again. He was speckled with barnacles, fine rosettes of lime. Again, this move towards roses and rose-like imagery, which suggests something almost feminine, considering what we're looking at. You can see this old Victorian wallpaper filled with roses. But then it's infested with tiny white sea lice, and underneath 2 or 3 rags of green weed hung down. So suddenly something that's quite lovely and domestic and almost pretty becomes something disgusting. It's filled with sea lice, and then it's got weeds hanging off it. His gills were breathing in the terrible oxygen, the frightening gills, fresh and crisp with blood that can cut so badly. Now what's also interesting is that she's caught this fish, which should be in itself, compared to a human, very vulnerable, very essentially fragile. Not fragile, but vulnerable. Let's just go with that. And here, suddenly the fish is something that can cut her. The gills are frightening. They're fresh and crisp with blood, and they can cut so badly. I mean, considering she's hooked this thing now has the possibility of potentially wounding her. I thought of the coarse white flesh packed in like feathers, the big bones and the little bones, the dramatic reds and blacks of his shiny entrails, and the pink swim bladder like a big peony. Again, she goes to different parts of the world to describe this fish. The flesh itself is like feathers, so we see something avian. Then she goes back to this image of a peony, something like the roses, again, something potentially stereotypically feminine, something that is largely pretty and decorative. I looked into his eyes, which were far larger than mine, but shallower and yellowed, the irises backed and packed with tarnished tinfoil seen through the lenses of old scratched isinglass. They shifted a little, but not to return my stare. This enters the part of the poem that probably starts to tell a little bit. It starts to point out what her anxiety is. Bishop at this point is looking at the fish that looks back at her, but doesn't necessarily register her. It was more like the tipping of an object toward the light. I admired his sullen face, the mechanism of his jaw, and then I saw that from his lower lip, if you could call it a lip, grim, wet, and weapon-like, hung 5 old pieces of fish line. I'm going to stop there for a moment. What interests me about that moment where she looks at the fish, and the fish looks back at her but doesn't register her, the eyes are sort of scratched like old glass that cannot perceive her really, and they don't return her stare. There's a moment where the human and the animal meet here, and they're supposed to sort of recognize each other, and she certainly recognizes the fish. She's able to name it on all of these different levels. It's venerable, but it's also homely. It's domestic, but it's also kind of from the sea. It's got pictures and images of flowers, and it's got images of feathers in it. And at this moment where she looks at it, it is something that has a face, if you could call it a face. It has a lower lip, if you could call it a lip. The sense of it being sort of uncannily like and not like her is again this sort of desperate attempt for her to try to capture in language what this fish is. And again, when we have all of these potentially contradictory descriptions of the fish, she keeps going with it. Suddenly we've got this image of the fish with 5 old pieces of fish line, or 4 and a wire leader with the swivel still attached, with all their 5 big hooks grown firmly in his mouth. Suddenly she realizes this fish has been caught before. In fact, many, many times before. This fish has just got like a little beard of all of these hooks that once got him and pulled him out. A green line, frayed at the end where he broke it, 2 heavier lines, and a fine black thread still crimped from the strain and snap when it broke and he got away. Like metals with their ribbons frayed and wavering, a 5-haired beard of wisdom trailing from his aching jaw. I stared, and victory filled up the little rented boat. These piles of similes that she's been giving us up to this point really show the difficulty, I think, that Elizabeth has in capturing the fish. Does she ever really catch this fish in the kind of language that she wants, that's adequate enough to describe what this thing is? I mean, on the one hand, we all know it's a fish, but you could say that about any object in our world. You know what a couch is, you know what a glass is, you know what a dog is, you know what a horse is, you know what another human might look like. But to actually capture these things in language takes quite a bit of work. And I think the fact that there's such a pileup of similes and that she continually changes them, alters them, she shifts them like tipping an object towards the light. Every time she tips it, she gets a new adjective, she gets a new series of descriptions. And by doing that, she gets to the larger issue at stake, which is, does anyone capture anything in language? Really, actually, no. Language is inadequate to describe what it is that we experience on a day-to-day level. And yet here we are, always using it, always sharing with each other in language what's happening. So the big picture of the fish is a very abstract concept, basically. How do you trust language when language doesn't actually do anything more than approximate the physical world? Well, you can show this by actually using a different series of physical images over and over to show how that they contradict each other. Is the fish domestic? Is the fish avian? Is the fish natural in terms of a rose? Is the fish like a general, a venerable old weight that has 5 big medals, basically? And as she's tried to capture the fish, of course, no one has captured it, too. I stared, and victory filled up the little rented boat. Victory is the telling word, right? It's this abstract word. Does anyone know what victory looks like? We can imagine what victory might feel like. We can imagine the sorts of pomp and circumstance that might go along with victory, right? The parades, the medals, the t-shirt that you get after the end of a race, something that gives you a physical approximation of victory. But victory itself, we don't see it. Victory filled up the little rented boat. from the pool of bilge where oil had spread a rainbow around the rusted engine to the bailer rusted orange, and sun-cracked thwarts, the oarlocks on their strings, the gunnels, until everything was rainbow, 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 and I let the fish go. What's interesting here is up to this point, Bishop has piled on imagery, similes, metaphor, very concrete physical description. Nothing is described in terms of victory up until the very end of this poem. But of course that victory rings hollow in comparison to what she's been proving before. Up to this point, the fish is a series of contradictory images that never get resolved. And so what kind of victory does she have? She has the fish, but then why does she let the fish go? Well, it's, I would argue, because she's never caught the fish, not in language, and not in the sense that that would ever satisfy her as a poet. And in fact, her language basically becomes more and more abstract towards the end. She can describe very concretely, of course, the boat and the cracked and rusted engine, the thwarts that are sun-cracked, and the oarlocks. But when she tries to go back to that fish, suddenly everything is very vague. It's rainbow, rainbow, rainbow. It's beautiful, but it's also in its own way kind of abstract. It's like the whole poem has been blocked out with light, all of these different colors kind of going and going and going. And that's why she lets the fish go. Now, of course, you could make the argument, well, why don't you just say outright, poetry and language don't really do more than approximate the real world. You could write that down. But how much more exciting and much more interesting is it to put the reader in the position where she's constantly unsure of where she stands? What is it that I'm looking at? What is it that I'm supposed to see? And if you give one image and then take it away and replace it with another image, you get that sense of disorientation. At the same time, you get the uncanny feeling that, in fact, you know exactly where you're standing, but it's always changing. And you can only really achieve that by spending a lot of time thinking about the power of the natural world and the contradictory physical images that we're given. When William says, there's no ideas but in things, Bishop's poem is, I think, a perfect illustration of what he's talking about. She gets to that very, very abstract idea through a series of very physical things that don't necessarily add up to anything more than an existential confusion. Do we ever actually possess what we think we possess? Anyway, I think that that's one of the reasons, JP, you should use more and more concrete imagery in your poetry, because concrete does not actually mean we know what we're looking at. It's the way in which you employ images against each other. It's the way in which you think about adjectives and verbs that animate the world, which is so filled with contradictory and difficult and very larger ideas. You can really only get through that by those sorts of details. Hopefully that answers your question. Probably it doesn't. If not, that's fine. Prose is for you. Thanks for listening. Bye.